Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming along to our, this is our second public event at Space Academy for 2019. For those who don't know me, my name's Tom. I'm one of the executive members for the Canterbury Socialist Society. Before we begin, there's just a couple of housekeeping things that I'd like to just get through quickly. Firstly, if you'd like to remain informed of our various events and stuff, we have a mailing list just over by the banner next to the door to the bathrooms there. You'll usually only get about 2 emails a month. Don't worry about feeling like you're going to get bombarded or anything like that. We try to keep it fairly to the point. You also, in order of appearance for our next few events, just so that you're aware, we've got social drinks next week at Pomeroy's on Thursday night, so we do it the third Thursday of every month. We'll do a social drinks there from 7 PM. Anyone's welcome to that. We talk a little bit about politics, but more often than not we don't really. We just sort of hang out and have a few beers and have a chat. Then following from that, Sunday the 24th, we're running a new series of events at the moment, which is the last Sunday of every month. We're doing a reading group, and that's on Sunday mornings from 11 till 12 noon. At the Avonloop Cottage, which is on Hurley Street, if you haven't been there before, just sort of off Barbados. And that's welcome to, everyone is welcome to attend that if you'd like to. Last month we did Wage, Labour and Capital, which is a sort of introductory text by Marx, and this month we're continuing with that a little bit with one called Value, Price and Profit, which is an introduction to his economic thinking. Beyond that, our March event is probably the next one, and that's going to be a screening of Pride, so that will be on Wednesday the 13th again, so we're here the second Wednesday of every month for this year. And that's going to coincide with the end of the Pride Festival in Christchurch, so if you haven't seen Pride, that's sort of about a gay communist group who go and support Welsh miners during the 1984 British miners' strike. Really good film, and should be really enjoyable. So you may have seen on Facebook that we are going to be live streaming this one. I will let you know though that we will be stopping the live stream for when we do questions at the end, just for your privacy, so don't worry about asking silly or weird questions or implicating your terrible employer, because it won't be recorded and you can say whatever you like. Cool, and finally, before we move on to the talk, I just want to extend our thanks to the Space Academy for hosting us again this year. It's been really awesome. We were here pretty much every month last year, and for the last couple months of 2017 as well, so it's been really awesome having them host us, and it's a really nice relationship to have and to be able to keep doing our events here. And I'm really, really pleased to have their ongoing support. So tonight's lecture has been titled An Epoch of Rest, and is on William Morris, a British socialist, artist and writer from the 19th century. Our speaker, Martin Crick, is the author of The History of the Social Democratic Federation, alongside many articles on British socialist history. Prior to coming to New Zealand, Martin was a trustee and vice chair of the William Morris Society, so it is our great pleasure to have him along tonight, clearly speaking on something he's passionate and deeply interested in, and I think it's going to be a really good talk. So taken from the alternate title for Morris's 1890 proto-science fiction novel, News from Nowhere, Epoch of Rest hints at More's conception of socialism, an era where toil and drudgery is replaced, not simply by leisure, but instead by the merger of work, art, life, pleasure, with the incessant thrumming activity of industrialism, which he was a vehement opponent of, is supplanted with a slower, peaceful period in which weary humanity may rest and find fulfillment in meaningful work, camaraderie, equality, fraternity, all that stuff. So Martin's going to be providing a sketch of Morris's life and thought, and identify how his political theory remains relevant for us today. The talk will run in 2 sections this evening, so it's slightly different from how we often do it, with a break in the middle for refreshments. Then we'll move directly into questions after the second part concludes, but we will, like I say, we will be pausing the recording for that part. So I'd like to invite you all to join me in welcoming and thanking Martin for doing the talk.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks to everybody for coming. I'm a sort of on leave of absence from the UK, escaping bad weather and Brexit, and the way that's going, I think I might stay for even longer than I intended. As Tom said, before I came from England 15 months ago now, I was Vice Chair of the William Morris Society, Chair of its Publications Committee. I was a trustee for about 10 years, so that probably tells you that I have a great interest in Morris. So I hope I can introduce you to the man and his thought and his work, and those of you who already know of him and have come across him before and are knowledgeable, then we can exchange ideas, and that would be great. Okay, so Robert Blatchford, editor of the Clarion newspaper, which was the most widely read and influential of all English socialist papers, also author of Merry England, with sales of well over 1 million copies, once said that he was too old to have a hero, but if he was to do so, that hero would be William Morris. G.D.H. Cole, eminent Labour historian, Fabian, Guild socialist, said he had a deeper devotion to Morris as a person than I have ever felt for any other whom I have not met face to face. Well, I'm a little bit older than Blatchford was when he said he was too old to have a hero, and I was only a kid when Cole said that he would love to meet Morris. But Morris is my hero, so I make no bones about that. So if you've come to hear a sort of objective, impartial, well, he did this, but he might have done that, and then you're going to be a little bit disappointed, because this is my take on Morris. So what is it that attracted and still attracts me to him? First of all, a sense of awe at his mastery of so many fields. On his death at the early age of 62, his family doctor said that he had died due to being William Morris and doing the work of 10 men in his lifetime. The sheer scale of his achievements is staggering. As a designer and design theorist, he had an enormous influence on late 19th and 20th century design and design teaching. Many of his designs, particularly for wallpaper, are still hugely popular today. Morris & Company became one of the leading interior decorating businesses of Victorian Britain. His private press, the Kelmscott Press, for which he designed many of the typefaces and borders, set new standards for high-quality book production. Furthermore, he was one of the leading poets of his generation, even suggested as a successor to Lord Tennyson as Poet Laureate. He was a novelist. He was an active force in the preservation of historic buildings. Finally, and to many people in his own time paradoxically, he was an important figure in the formative years of the British Socialist movement, both as an activist and as a theorist. His closest friend and fellow artist, the pre-Raphaelite Edward Burne-Jones, described him thus: "When I first knew Morris, nothing would content him but being a monk and getting to Rome. And then he must be an architect, and apprenticed himself and worked for 2 years. But when I came to London and began to paint, he threw it all up and must paint too. And then he must give it up and make poems. And then he must give it up and make window hangings and pretty things. And when he'd achieved that, he must be a poet again. And then after 2 or 3 years of earthly paradise time, he must learn dyeing and lived in a vat, and learned weaving and knew all about looms. And then he made more books and learned tapestry. And then he wanted to smash everything up and begin the world anew." That's the good bit. "And now it is printing he cares for, and to make wonderful, rich-looking books. And all things he did splendidly. And if he lives, the printing will have an end, but not, I hope, before Chaucer and the Morte Arthur are done. Then he'll do I don't know what, but every minute will be alive." The second thing that attracts me, connected to the first, is his ability to switch seemingly effortlessly from one creative activity to another. I don't know about you, I find it very hard to focus on one. You know, I can't switch from reading a book about Morris's politics to painting over here and then going over there to do something else and then come up and pick it up where I left off. Morris, however, could, as his son-in-law, Halliday Sparling, remembered. He would be standing at an easel or sitting with a sketchbook in front of him, charcoal brush or pencil in hand, and all the while be grumbling Homer's Greek under his breath, the design coming through in clear, unhesitating strokes. Then the note of the grumbling changed, for the time of the English had come. He was translating the Odyssey at this time. He would prowl about the room, filling and lighting his pipe, halting to add a touch or two at one or other easel, still grumbling, go to his writing table, snatch up his pen and write furiously for a while, 20, 50, 100 or more lines as the case might be. Then the speed of his hand would gradually slacken. His eye would wander to an easel, a sketch block, or to some other of the manuscripts in process, and that would have its turn. The deliberate ease with which he interchanged so many forms of creative work, taking up each one exactly at the point which he laid it aside, and never halting to recapture the thread of his thought. And to the skills described in those two reminiscences, we might add calligraphy, embroidery, and many more. Another doctor said that he died a victim of his enthusiasm for spreading the principles of socialism. And here is the third source of my enthusiasm for Morris. For many, youthful idealism tends to fade as they get older, as they face the pressures of work, family, life, mortgages. I'm sure you're all familiar with those things. At best, it becomes a grudging acceptance of the status quo. At worst, either immersion in the system or apathy. Yet William Morris became a socialist at the age of 49, and his radicalism increased as he got older. Again, his indefatigable energy amazes me. Between 1884 and 1890, he wrote almost 500 signed articles in Justice and Commonweal, including poetry, prose, fiction, dialogues, essays and lectures. He travelled the length and breadth of the country speaking on street corners, in lecture halls, to small groups of members in dingy meeting rooms, or to mass rallies of striking miners in Northumbria. In 1887 alone, he spoke 107 times. He was arrested, and as one member of the Socialist League admiringly remembered, he fought alongside them when their rallies were disrupted by opponents or broken up by the police. He was a towering figure, indeed, in my opinion, the preeminent figure in the socialist movement of his time, and a major influence on socialists throughout the 20th century. Harold Lasky remembers miners in the 1930s in Northumbria, their cottages emptied of furniture by the bailiffs during the Great Depression, still retaining and clinging on to their copies of Morris's work, their last possessions. Countless Labour politicians in the UK claim to have been converted to socialism by his utopian novel News from Nowhere. He's been championed by social democrats, by communists, by anarchists, and more recently by the ecological movement. What distinguishes him for me, however, and for Blatchford, and for G.D.H. Cole, and for E.P. Thompson, who I would suggest is his preeminent biographer, is the originality of his thought and the moral dimension of his socialism. Where then can I begin? I can't hope to cover the vast scope of his achievements in the course of one lecture. Each of the various aspects of his life and work has been subject to scrutiny. I will suggest, however, that it is a mistake to separate Morris into these component parts, that we need to understand the centrality of work to his life, and that his art and his socialism were inextricably linked. So, a brief sketch of his life and achievements before his conversion to socialism at the age of 49, a more detailed examination of his socialist activity, then a brief break to either wake up or go to the loo or whatever it is you need to do, and then I'll take a look at his legacy and some reflections on his contemporary relevance. And finally, and very briefly, because I've only just begun to look at this, and it's something that's increasingly of interest to me, his influence or otherwise upon New Zealand. I'm hoping that perhaps in the audience there may be people who could go, we could tell you about this, or we could point you to that, and that would be extremely useful to me. Thank you. So, William Morris was born on the 24th of March 1834 at Elm House, Walthamstow, then a pleasant village in the Lee Valley countryside. No longer such. That plaque remembers the house where he was born. It's now opposite the fire station in a very built-up area. His father had moved from Worcester to London in the 1820s to join a firm of city stockbrokers. And when Morris was 10, his father bought 272 £1 shares in a new Devonshire mining company, copper mining. Within 6 months, those shares were worth £200,000, a fortune for those times. On his father's early death in 1847, Morris inherited an annual income of £900, which allowed him, amongst other things, to collect fine manuscripts, finance his business ventures, and later to fund his socialist activity. The family then moved to Waterhouse in Walthamstow, which is now the William Morris Gallery. And if any of you are ever visiting London, I can highly recommend a visit to the William Morris Gallery. In 1843, he went to Marlborough College, which he disliked intensely, and where he said he learnt next to nothing. but the surrounding downs were rich in Neolithic and Bronze Age remains, and here began his long fascination and relationship with the past. He loved too to read Sir Walter Scott's novels. In 1853 he went to Exeter College, Oxford, to study medieval history. At that time, influenced by the High Church Anglicanism of the Oxford movement, he intended to take up a career in the church. But here he met his lifelong friend, Edward Burne-Jones, pictured here with Morris in the garden of Burne-Jones's house in 1874, and others who would form a significant circle of influences and support for the rest of his life. Equally importantly, he read Carlyle, Keats and Ruskin, and came to share their romantic revulsion towards Victorian capitalism, their rejection of a society which placed economic values above all others. Here too began his preoccupation with the art and religion of the medieval past. Ruskin was the major influence upon Morris at this time, and from him he developed three key ideas. One, the essential dignity of useful and constructive labour. Two, the role of art in expressing moral judgments about the quality of life in a society. And three, from Ruskin's essay The Nature of Gothic, later to be reprinted at the Kelmscott Press, the architectural importance of the great European cathedrals, which he saw as a living record of a creative workforce taking pleasure in their work, predating the debasement of art under capitalism. In the summer of 1855, he visited northern France to see these for himself, and he and Edward Burne-Jones resolved to dedicate their lives to art. To the disappointment of his family, therefore, Morris abandoned a career in the church, and in 1856 he was articled to the Gothic revival architect G.E. Street. Within a year he abandoned that too, having fallen under the spell of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and determined to become an artist. Rossetti was the leading figure in the pre-Raphaelite movement, a group of artists who, like Morris, looked back to a pre-industrial era and who challenged prevailing artistic conventions. Rossetti's influence can be seen in Morris's only surviving painting, Queen Guinevere. A portrait of his wife Jane, one of the pre-Raphaelite stunners, as they were called, whom he married in 1859. On the back of the canvas he wrote, "I love you, but I cannot paint you." And that was indeed the case. His awkward style that we see here was overshadowed by Burne-Jones and by Rossetti, who painted this picture of Jane Morris. And those of you who are in the know, of course, will know that Jane Morris became Rossetti's mistress later on. Morris found his artistic talents best employed in the decorative arts, ceramics, furniture, stained glass, textiles, wallpapers and book design. His design career began with Red House at Bexley Heath in Kent, his first married home, built for him by the architect Philip Webb. My second recommendation for a visit if you visit the UK. Wonderful place. Stephen Coleman has said that the house revolutionised Victorian design and marked the beginning of modern architecture in Britain. With a group of friends, including Burne-Jones and Rossetti, Morris embarked on a scheme to design and supervise the production of his own furnishings for the house. It was a labour of love to which Morris's whole circle of friends contributed, proudly handcrafted by workers involved throughout the building process. And you can see the hallway there at Red House. I visited a couple of years ago just as they'd pulled a wardrobe away from the wall and discovered a whole new mural on the wall painted by Rossetti and Burne-Jones and others, still in pristine, pretty good condition. Just an amazing find. From exterior to interior furnishings, it's become a monument to the arts and crafts movement. And the success of the venture led to the formation of Morris, Marshall, Faulkner and Company in 1861. Morris could call upon some of the finest artists of the 19th century to design for him. He insisted on authenticity, would only use natural materials and dyes, traditional techniques, so much so that at the Great Exhibition of 1862, the committee attempted to disqualify the firm's products on the grounds that they were genuine medieval artefacts that the firm had touched up. Where Morris could find people to teach him the old techniques, he used them. Where they were lost, he reinvented them and then taught them to his workforce. In the firm, Ruskin's ideas about the dignity of labour, of combining brain and manual work, and of performing the main task from beginning to end were put into practice. Ruskin condemned the gulf that had grown between artists and craftspeople, and he believed that the factory system, with its division of labour, had taken away the creative process from the workforce. Morris would further develop these ideas in his own writings. Another interesting little sideline on Morris, if you like. When there were any employment vacancies at the firm, Morris took on the first applicant. He didn't interview them all. He took on the first because he believed that anyone was capable of creative work and beautiful work if they were given the opportunity. The medieval character of much of the firm's early work appealed to the Gothic revival architects engaged in church building, and commissions for stained glass provided substantial income in the early years. And we've got 3 examples here of stained glass. Apologies for the quality of the slides, but so just 1, 2 and 3, Tom. But stained glass was one of the main sources of income for the firm in the early years, but the reputation of the company was firmly established at the end of the 1860s with 2 prestigious commissions: the decoration of the Armoury and Tapestry Room at St James's Palace, and the decoration of the Green Dining Room at the South Kensington Museum, now the Victoria and Albert Museum. So that's now a... there's a coffee in there, if I remember now. Right. That's, yeah. In 1875, Morris assumed full control of the firm and abbreviated the name to Morris and Company. He condemned the mass-produced, badly made products of the Industrial Revolution, and he disliked the fussiness and clutter of typical Victorian interiors, saying, "I have never been in any rich man's home which would not have looked better for having a bonfire made outside of it of 9/10 of all it held." His plea for quality and simplicity in home decoration led to his golden rule: have nothing in your house which you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. This doesn't mean to say that he wanted to slavishly recreate Gothic art and architecture, the art of the past. What was important for him was the manner of the work, bringing out the creativity of the worker and the integrity of the process. Morris's greatest skill as a designer was undoubtedly his ability to create repeating patterns. The patterns that he created for his wallpaper reflected his attempt to recreate an essence of the natural world outside the cities. He wanted, he said, patterns to be a visible symbol of nature, clothing our daily and domestic walls with ornaments that remind us of the outward face of the earth, of the innocent love of animals, or of man passing his days between work and rest. 3 slides, Tom. So I've just put 3 examples of his wallpaper up here. That's pomegranate, which I have on one of my walls at home. And you can see what I mean about repeating patterns, which if you had a full length of wallpaper would just repeat on a flat surface. Whilst the woven and printed fabrics and wallpapers show his design skills to their greatest advantage, he was also interested in all areas of furnishing textiles, including embroidery, carpets, printed fabrics for curtains and upholstery. There's an example of a Hammersmith rug. Morris came to tapestry weaving fairly late in his career, weaving the first one in 1879 on a hand loom set up in his bedroom at Kelmscott House. Yet they form the high point of the firm's textile production and are some of the great achievements of 19th century textile design and manufacture. So this one is the famous Adoration of the Magi designed by Edward Burne-Jones, and that just does not give you anywhere near a picture of how stunning the colours are when you see the full thing up on the wall. Whilst his emphasis on hand production meant that his furnishings were expensive, the company did produce a range of more affordable goods, including the very popular Sussex chairs. That's probably the archetypal Sussex chair, and also an armchair in the Sussex range as well. And also embroidery kits that you could buy and sort of recreate the patterns that the firm had designed. And whilst Morris designed his wallpaper, experimented with his dyes, and there's some wonderful descriptions of him up to his elbows in dye, and his arms are stained blue because he insisted that he had to master the process before he let the workforce loose on it. He also wrote poetry. In 1868, parts 1 and 2 of The Earthly Paradise were published, and in 1870, parts 3 and 4. These were enormously successful and established his reputation as a writer. 20 years later, he was still referred to as the author of The Earthly Paradise. So in mid-Victorian society, Morris was increasingly a success and patronised by its most prominent members. Yet the more success he attracted, the more dissatisfied he became. As a designer, his goal was ambitious: to provide tasteful, affordable alternatives to the shoddy and inferior mass-produced products of the Industrial Revolution. Yet the processes he used meant that his furnishings were expensive and could not compete in a mass market. His clients were the wealthy, the very people he despised. But to make his products cheaper would mean to surrender to mass production and to the separation of the worker from his work, which also went against his philosophy. Hence his famous outburst about only ministering to the swinish luxury of the rich. On one occasion, he lost a commission to provide a silk and gold altar cross for a church because he attached to his estimate the following note: "In consideration of the fact that the above item is a wholly unnecessary and inexcusable extravagance, at a time when thousands of poor people in this so-called Christian country are in want of food, additional charge to that set forth above £10. His passionate sense of the beauty of the world and its artistic heritage collided with the impact upon him of the ugliness imposed upon the world by industrial capitalism and its pursuit of profit. In his lecture, Art and Socialism, he angrily denounced a system which produced two peoples living street by street and door by door, people of the same blood, the same tongue, and at least nominally under the same laws, but yet one civilised and the other uncivilised. To this point, his was a romantic revolt against the age. He admitted that he saw no hope of change. Reflecting upon this time in How I Became a Socialist, written in 1894, he said, "The immediate future seemed to me likely to intensify all the present evils by sweeping away the last survivals of the days before the dull squalor of civilization had settled down on the world. Think of it! Was it all to end in a counting house on top of a cinder heap, with Podsnap's drawing room in the offing, and a Whig committee dealing out champagne to the rich and margarine to the poor in such convenient proportions as would make all men contented together? Yet believe me, in my heart, when I really forced myself to look towards the future, that is what I saw in it. And as far as I could tell, scarce anyone seemed to think it worthwhile to struggle against such a consummation of civilization." His poetry at the time also reflected what had been termed his exquisite despair. "Dreamer of dreams, born out of my due time, why should I strive to set the crooked straight? Let it suffice me that my murmuring rhyme beats with light wing against the ivory gate, telling a tale not too importunate to those who in the sleepy region stay, lulled by the singer of an empty day." In 1871, having recently taken the tenancy of Kelmscott Manor in Oxfordshire, place 3 on your tour of the UK, he began to travel to Iceland, in part to escape a society that was overwhelming him. It's very clear at the beginning of the 1870s he was very depressed about what he saw, and he saw no hope of any way of changing it. Iceland he saw as a pre-industrial society, where everything from the landscape to human relations seemed unspoiled. He immersed himself in reading and translating Nordic folklore, as you do, exploring the nature of Victorian society through this medium. For example, his poem Sigurd the Volsung replaced the romance between the traditional characters and made lust for gold the motivating force. This use of the past to expose the realities of the present became a characteristic feature of his later work. I should also note, however, that he left Kelmscott Manor for another reason. When he went to Iceland, he left his wife Jane there with her lover Rossetti. Their affair caused Morris great pain, as you can see if you read his poem Love Is Enough and the unfinished novel On Blue Paper. But he knew that due to the double standards of Victorian life, any scandal that erupted around that relationship would have destroyed Jane's reputation and not Rossetti's or Morris's. And later, as he worked his ideas out, he referred to marriage as a bourgeois property institution which made women the property of their husbands, which of course in Victorian society was exactly the case. And so his despair, the contradiction between the society he revered and the actual society he lived in, eventually drove him into politics. His first public stance was to found the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, or Anti-Scrape, of which he became both secretary and treasurer. There is a recurring theme in all Morris's activities that he becomes the treasurer of whichever organisation he joins. This was launched to oppose the crude and insensitive restoration of ancient buildings and monuments, mutilation as Morris saw it. Morris drew on Ruskin for his manifesto. Take proper care of your monuments and you will not need to restore them. And many a generation will still be born to pass away beneath its shadow. And then, at the end of October 1876, aghast at the prospect of Britain supporting Turkey in a war against Russia, he wrote a letter of protest to the Daily News. Turkish atrocities against the Christian population of Bulgaria fueled this opposition. And when Liberal leader William Gladstone wrote a pamphlet, The Bulgarian Horrors and the Question of the East, attacking Disraeli, Morris weighed in on Gladstone's side. This crisis, of course, was part of the establishment's attempt to convert a British working class with a fine tradition of internationalism into supporters of imperialism, the idea that we had a God-given right to empire and that prosperity at home depended on expansion abroad, and in this case, securing control of the Suez Canal. To oppose war, radical clubs in London combined to form the Eastern Question Association, and guess what? Morris became treasurer. He made his first public speech on this issue at St James's Hall, London, on the 8th of December 1876, wrote a ballad, Wake London Lads, and published an open letter in May 1877 to the working men of England, exhorting them not to fight, not to be duped by any appeal to spurious patriotism. Mahamdali describes this as a magnificent blast against the British establishment that up to then had regarded Morris as perhaps eccentric, but essentially one of them. Not a natural public speaker, Morris had begun to lecture on art, but he now fused his long-held artistic critique with his anti-imperialism. In Birmingham in 1879, he told his audience that whilst we met here in Birmingham to further the spread of education in art, Englishmen in India are actively destroying the very sources of that education. The famous and historical arts of their great peninsula have been thrust aside for the advantage of any paltry scrap of so-called commerce. And a year later he wrote, I began to doubt if civilization itself may not be sometimes so adulterated as scarcely worth the carrying. And how can it be worth much when it is necessary to kill a man in order to make him accept it? He soon became disillusioned with the Liberal Party. He realised that Gladstone had opportunistically jumped on the back of the Eastern Question Association in the hope of getting rid of Disraeli and replacing him as Prime Minister. For a short while he searched for an alternative. He became Treasurer of the National Liberal League in 1879, formed to help working men become Liberal candidates, and he helped to form a short-lived radical union, an amalgam of London working class groups. But with Gladstone back in office, refusing to cancel Disraeli's annexation of the Transvaal, passing the notorious 1881 Irish Coercion Bill, and ordering the shelling of Alexandria, Morris's delusion with both the Liberal Party and parliamentary politics was complete. And he looked round for an alternative. Anybody, he said, who distinctly called themselves socialist. Just a brief word about terminology before I take a look at Morris's socialism. Morris called himself a communist, and he said that he did not wish to qualify that word by associating it with any other. George Bernard Shaw remembered that Morris was insistent that the only word he was happy with was communist. Yet at that time it was not in common use. It more often than not had the suffix or prefix anarchist, anarcho-communist or communist anarchist. Neither was Marxism as a term in use. Those who identified themselves with Marxist thought called themselves social democrats. It seems likely, says Ruth Kinner, that he used the term precisely because it marked his independence from other schools of socialist thought. And it also means that we have to be wary with hindsight of using terminology with the 20th century or 21st century connotations when referring to what Morris was doing back at the end of the 19th century. The second point to note is there were hardly any English translations of Marx's works available outside the Communist Manifesto at that time. Capital was not translated into English until 1887, and some of his earlier work remained unknown till much later. The Grundrisse, for example, where his moral emphases chimed very much with those of Morris, wasn't actually translated into English until 1973, a century after Morris became a socialist. So, with those points in mind, in the winter of 1882, Morris attended a series of lectures entitled The Stepping Stones to Socialism, organised by the Democratic Federation, an organisation launched by an eccentric ex-Tory radical, Henry Mayers Heinemann. In January 1883, he became a member. As he wrote to his friend, C.E. Morris, nothing can argue me out of this feeling, which I say plainly is a matter of religion for me. The contrasts of rich and poor are unendurable and ought not to be endured by rich or poor. He was soon elected to the executive as treasurer. He designed the membership card, and with Heinemann wrote a summary of the principles of socialism. He also set about a serious study of Marx's writings, reading Das Kapital in French. Years later, in How I Became a Socialist, Morris said that he suffered agonies of the brain over the pure economics of Capital, although the historical chapters appealed to him very strongly. These words have long been used to argue that Morris was hostile to Marx, and this is quite simply an unsustainable argument. Morris's own writings demonstrate quite clearly that he fully accepted Marx's view of history as a sequence of class struggles that would end with the victory and emancipation of the workers, that there would be a social revolution that would institute a classless society, and that this would have to be fought for. In How I Became a Socialist, he wrote this: "So there I was in a fine pessimistic end of life. If it had not somehow dawned on me that amidst all this filth, the seeds of a great change, what we others call social revolution, were beginning to germinate. What must be emphasised, however, is that Morris had already developed many of the ideas which would characterise his thought prior to reading Marx. In the lesser arts and in the art of the people, he decried the distinction between art and craft which occurred with the specialisation of labour under capitalism. Such a distinction, he said, did not exist in the Middle Ages. The separation of art from craft created a false dichotomy between the two, elevating some arts above others. The specialisation of labour also alienated workers from their labour. Morris came up with an alienation of labour before that was available in English for anybody else to read. So, you know, it deprived them of that pleasure in work which Morris regarded as essential. Humans have a tendency, he said, to decorate their artefacts. This is an expression of their essential humanity, and such decorative art is the true art of the people. For a time, he thought that the remedy was to raise up the lesser arts so that capitalism was no longer able to undermine them through the production of shoddy goods. But in Hopes and Fears for Art, in 1882, he realised that a social revolution was necessary. His reading of Marx, and particularly the historical sections of Capital, convinced him that this would come. It gave him hope, where previously there had only been despair. And paradoxically, just at the time he announced himself a revolutionary socialist, the establishment prepared to welcome him to its ranks. In July 1883, he was made a Fellow of Exeter College, and 4 months later he was invited to make a speech there, with Ruskin in the audience. Here he laid out his views on art. I ask you, he said, to extend the word art beyond those matters which are consciously works of art, to take in not only painting and sculpture and architecture, but the shapes and colours of all household goods, nay, even the arrangement of the fields for tillage and pasture, the management of towns and of our highways of all kinds. In a word, to extend it to the aspect of all the externals of our life. But he also delivered a storming indictment of capitalism, including an extraordinary denunciation of the cruelty of war. The audience and the college authorities were shocked. The press lambasted him, but Morris was undeterred. He had crossed his river of fire, and in so doing knew that he had alienated and separated himself from his previous milieu, from his mentors and friends who had taken refuge in their art. He, on the other hand, had thrown in his lot with the working class. The Democratic Federation became the Social Democratic Federation in 1883, with a specifically socialist manifesto, and in January 1884 launched a weekly newspaper, Justice. Its launch marked the beginning of Morris's prolific socialist writing. In addition to his socialist writing, it has also been calculated that he lectured or spoke at about 3 political meetings per week on average, over 1,000 in total, almost always on the relationship between art and society, art and capitalism, or art and socialism. In later years, communism and the nature of work assumed increasing prominence as subject matter. As he wrote and lectured, he re-examined and refined his ideas, and he became more radical. In December 1884, Morris and others broke away from the SDF to set up a rival organisation, the Socialist League. They objected to Hyman's autocratic methods, to his opportunism, and to his jingoism. This was undoubtedly a tactical error, but we must remember that socialists at this time were very much in uncharted territory. They had no models to follow, no consistent theory to guide them. Continental exiles in Britain strained against a nascent electoral politics and trade unionism. Anarchists argued with collectivists. An appealing innocence, says Stephen Coleman, characterised the early British debates about socialism. Not the case for common ownership of resources, democratic control of social affairs, and production for need rather than profit had a superior ethical and logical force to any defence of capitalism, seemed to require little justification. The only question was how to bring it about in its most uncorrupted form. In February 1885, the League published the first edition of its newspaper, Commonweal, along with the party's manifesto, and Morris also designed the membership card. Yeah. Which is mine, that's my proudest possession, I think. It's actually signed by Morris himself, so excuse me if I go in a corner and get all excited again. 3 things stand out from the Socialist League manifesto. Its internationalism, its commitment to women's liberation, and we're talking the 1880s here, where, you know, this is a very unusual stance. Many people in the socialist movement had no time for women's liberation, They thought all of those things would be sorted out once the revolution had occurred, and you know, it would be a byproduct of the socialist revolution, but it wasn't something to be campaigned for separately. Morris was firm. He did not consider a man a socialist at all who is not prepared to admit the equality of women. And Morris's view, the third thing, that the road to socialism would involve the seizure of state power. No amount of administrative changes, no palliatives would make any real difference to the inequalities of society. The task of socialists was to educate and agitate, to encourage the working class to see the possibility of a different world, so that when the time came, it would be an informed revolution rather than insurrection and riot. I don't want to deal in detail with the events of the Socialist League years. Like most socialists in the early 80s, Morris believed that revolution was imminent. The events of Bloody Sunday on the 13th of November 18... I missed one. I lost one. That's it. Yeah. The events of Bloody Sunday, 13th of November 1887, when police and troops violently broke up a demonstration protesting against coercion in Ireland and supporting the right of free speech in Trafalgar Square, made him realise the power of the state and to accept that in all likelihood the revolution would not happen in his lifetime. A week later, at a further demonstration protesting against the events of the previous week, a young man, Alfred Linnell, was knocked down by a police horse and subsequently died of his injuries. Morris wrote a death song for Linnell to raise funds for the family, thus demonstrating yet another of his achievements and influences. He wrote chants and songs for the socialist movement to help recruit and inspire members. They were hugely popular, sung at meetings, at rallies, on marches, at socialist Sunday schools and in socialist churches. So, Chants for Socialists by William Morris. Unfortunately, at a time when the working class was beginning to stir in the UK, with the advent of new unionism mobilising the unskilled workers, the dock workers, the gas workers, the match workers, and when the demands for an independent political voice were beginning to be heard, the Socialist League was divided. One group, based around the Bloomsbury branch, its leading lights Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter, and Edward Aveling, favoured an electoral approach and working with the trade unions. Another, anarchist faction, fiercely opposed such an approach. Morris initially sided with the latter, largely due to his hostility to Parliament and to reforms. Any attempt, he said, to alter a part of the profit system would always be overwhelmed by the ferocity of the whole. Palliatives were simply a means of buying off one section of the working class at the expense of another, and at any time that the economic situation deteriorated, those gains would be lost. He also objected very strongly to socialism being seen as a mere economic change, leading to state control which would merely mask the essential continuity of exploitation. As for Parliament, it was a corrupt institution, marked by vanity, intrigue and ambition, and which fostered illusions in the possibility of a peaceful transformation of society. Again, this stance has been misread and has led some to term Morris an anarchist, but his polemics in Commonweal against the anarchist faction that eventually captured the League should easily disabuse them. The real importance of the Socialist League years lies in the appearance of many of his most famous works, initially in the pages of Commonweal. The first was the Pilgrims of Hope, a long narrative poem based on the events of the Paris Commune. Then came A Dream of John Ball. Edward Thompson has called this a meditation on the meaning of history. Morris uses a familiar device, his narrator falling asleep in the present day, only to awake and find himself back in 14th century Kent at the time of the Peasants' Revolt, and in conversation with the revolutionary priest John Ball. Here Morris illustrates his grasp of the dialectic, the idea that the struggles of medieval England and of Victorian England are essentially the same. History is a continuous struggle between the forces of personal and spiritual liberation and those of economic and social division and repression. He asserts the necessity of a conscious agency of change, otherwise chaos will be the outcome. And out of this struggle will come the transformation of society. When John Ball hears that the Peasants' Revolt, by challenging the economic, spiritual and ideological basis of society, will ultimately sweep away the old order, but only to replace it with capitalism, he is distraught. He asks what then his role in history will be, and the narrator ponders how men fight and lose the battle. And the thing that they fight for comes about in spite of their defeat. And when it comes, turns out to be not what they meant, and other men have to fight for what they meant under another name. A model, I think, which is only too familiar to socialists in the 20th and the 21st century. But as Morris said, the past is not dead. It is living in us and will be alive in the future, which we are now helping to make. And then, between January and October 1890, news from nowhere. his most comprehensive work of socialist vision, and his most widely read work. Morris's political writings are full of vision, appeals to vision, vision as a means of identifying one's aim, vision as a spur to action, and a shield against the dangers implicit in politics of becoming so preoccupied with the journey that the destination becomes forgotten or irrelevant. News from Nowhere is the greatest example of his emphasis on the education of desire. People must want a better world, must be able to imagine a better world. And it is the first utopia to have a history. It didn't emerge out of nowhere, a fantastical land like cocaine and other utopias, brought into being by enlightened thinkers who know what's best for us all. It is located within the continuity of history, born out of a class struggle chronicled in detail. The novel was written as a counterblast to Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, a highly popular novel in the late 19th century, and the little bit of research I've been doing on New Zealand shows that it was immensely popular over here as well. It's a novel set in Boston in the year 2000, describing a drab, highly regimented, highly centralised state capitalist society, which had been brought about by the gradual merging of monopolies into the corporate state. Work was a highly regimented obligation, with a strong differentiation between mental and physical labour, rewarded by the state with labour credit vouchers which could be used to buy goods. The key difference between Bellamy and Morris was that the former dismissed all idea of revolution, whereas Morris makes it clear in the chapter How the Change Came that it had to be fought for violently. And although the revolution was set in 1952, the events and characters place News from Nowhere in Victorian times, because Morris wants us to be sure that the future is not simply a dream, but a possibility growing out of the conditions of present-day society. And he describes how under communism, people, their lives, their outlook on life, and their relations with one another would be transformed. Whereas in Bellamy's utopia, people's aim was to retire at 45, and the highlight of people's leisure would be listening to the radio. In News from Nowhere, we find Morris's fullest expression of what we today would call an ecological society, sketched out previously in many essays and lectures. This was far more than an instinctive aesthetic reaction to the destruction of the landscape. In News from Nowhere, we have a detailed description of a small-scale decentralised society as well as the likely appearance of its landscape. He considered what effect his political principles would have if put into effect on human society and surrounding nature. Morris's reflections on the relationship between art and society in the late 1870s gave rise to both his politics and his ecological ideas. For example, in The Lesser Arts, he reflects upon a simplicity of lifestyle, harmony with nature, the inherent wastefulness of the market, and the nature of work. Unless people cared about carrying on their business without making the world hideous, he wrote, how can they care about art? By 1877, he had not only recognised pollution as the inevitable consequence of industrialisation, but he had also found a role for scientists in the care and maintenance of a small planet. And as Morris defined art, in the widest sense, as all of human enterprise and expression, then for him, a society which did not care about the despoliation of nature did not care for itself. One topic he took up time and time again was the nature of work under capitalism, and its potential for transformation under a socialist society. In Useful Work versus Useless Toil, written in 1885, he argues that present society alienates us from what we produce. He differentiates between good work, which is not far removed from a blessing, and bad work, which is a curse and a burden. The difference between the two lies in the kind of work and who and what it is for. Under capitalism, a tiny class of people exploits a working class that produces all that is produced and supports both itself and the other classes, though it is placed in a position of inferiority to them. Real inferiority, mind you, involving a degradation of both mind and body. It produces useless articles of luxury and folly for the rich, inferior goods for its own consumption, a world turned upside down, even to a corruption of words such as wealth, or as Morris would have it, ilth. Consumerism, he argued, had bred desires which he forbids us to satisfy, and so is not merely a niggard, but a torturer also. Instead of labouring to live with hope of rest, pleasure and products both useful and beautiful, men now lived to labour. And I should emphasise here that Morris, unlike some commentators, Morris was not against mechanisation, full stop. He was very clear that a communist society could not and did not mean a forced return to the past. But machines, he said, had not been used as labour-saving devices, to reduce working hours and repetitive labour. Instead, they have been used to de-skill workers and to replace them. He also considered where we work, in a factory as it might be, describing a workplace environment very different to the ones that we understand. A liberation from the drudgery of work under capitalism for Morris would herald the realisation of his lifelong desire, the union of art and labour. In Art and Socialism, he issued a damning indictment of free market capitalism, where value was not determined by an item's intrinsic worth, but by its position in the marketplace. In Victorian society, art was defined by and confined to the rich, but under socialism, it would become a part of the fabric of everyday life. I do not want art for a few, any more than education for a few, or a freedom for a few, he argued. The revolution of humanity's relationship to work would rebuild the art of the people. And when people once more take pleasure in their work, when the pleasure rises to a certain point, the expression of it will become irresistible. And the expression of pleasure is art, whatever form it takes. What we see in News from Nowhere is a society of autonomous, self-reliant communities where manual and mental labour are integrated, where work is both satisfying and creative, where the divisions between town and country, between classes and between science and art are eliminated. Morris's belief that goods should be of the highest quality so that they last as long as possible would minimise ecological damage. And he arrived at this position by an instinctive understanding of what he later found had been called by Marx the theory of surplus value. Production for needs rather than wants would satisfy the requirements of society and eliminate surplus value, and this in turn would lighten the pressure on the rest of nature. In 1890, Morris left the Socialist League, now controlled by the anarchist faction, and founded the Hammersmith Socialist Society. He made his peace with Heinemann and the SDF, and he played a leading role in trying to forge one socialist party. Although his socialist activity declined, and this was partly due to his increasing ill health, he never stopped developing his politics. He shifted away from some of his previous positions. In Communism, written in 1893, he recognised that his belief in the inevitability of a sudden and speedy change had distorted the activities of the Socialist League. He supported now the struggles for higher wages, shorter hours, working class representation on local bodies. It led him to acknowledge that maybe there was an interim stage in the struggle for communism. But his revolutionary flame burned as bright as ever. Communism, he said, is in fact the completion of socialism. When that ceases to be militant and becomes triumphant, it will be communism. In these last years, only 6, suffering from ill health, he wrote a series of prose romances, 7 in all. For example, The House of the Wolfings and The Water of the Wondrous Isles. And of course he founded the Kelmscott Press, the result of a long-held enthusiasm for printing and book design. He was a great collector. Staying true to his principles, believing that books should be a work of art, only the best materials were used, the finest paper, the right ink and right typefaces, including 3 he designed himself. The most beautiful of all books, the Kelmscott Chaucer, illustrated by Edward Burne-Jones and with layout and page decoration by Morris himself, was completed shortly before his death on the 3rd of October 1896. Almost his last words were, "I want to get mumbo jumbo out of the world." And there we'll have a break, and I'm happy to take any questions or contributions now, or we can have a 10-minute break, and then I want to just have a look at his legacy and his contemporary relevance and a few snippets that I've gathered about Morris and New Zealand, just to see if that gives anything coming back my way. Okay.
Yeah. I got a marble photo.
Marble photo.
Yeah. So it's usually white, and then it's like pixels, like marble.
Delicious.
But
So we can like just up there.
well, no, you like photos of classes.
Oh.
So it's like who would be next one?
Because I had to pay like a fee for one of my things. I don't think I need a license.
I need an importance number, but I believe the number comes from the license. But yeah, they also put GST on it.
Yeah. Import tax is like
But
import tax. It's like
yeah, but was that your computer something?
no, because PDT did that.
No.
There was something else. It was about $600.
Oh yeah, it was only that much. It was like
Yeah, I thought you paid import tax.
yeah,
And I was like, why did you put 1 cent on the box? It's very easy, guys.
yeah.
Like, I'm all for tax.
It's
but-
not like
Should we just go and explore our home? Supermarket.
oh, they're the platforms.
Hey, 30 seconds. Oh, no. I don't know who I want to bust on that.
Yeah. I don't know how well it will turn out, but what was that song that you recommended?
Oh, it's called Holochain. H-O-L-O-C-H-A-I-N. We have, it takes, it's really hard to describe, but essentially it's an agent-centric platform for decentralized applications. So the idea is that you and I are both running an application on our own devices, and we can interact, and whenever we have a transaction, we both keep a copy on our private chains, which are cryptographically secure, but they're not shared with anyone else. And so it does away with the idea of, are you familiar with cryptocurrency? Yeah. Oh yeah. So it does away with the idea of global consensus, right? Which is that there's one truth, and the entire planet has to share the work of keeping track of every. It's kind of a ridiculous idea. When
It doesn't really scale.
it doesn't scale at all. And Holochain scales because it actually takes a sensible approach, which is it essentially mimics elementary accounting. And there's some other neat features, like for example, if I write an application and share it with you, the apps are verified based on on the hash of the source code.
Okay.
So it's built into the protocol that the protocol doesn't work on an application unless everyone involved is running the same source code and it's verified. And it's entirely voluntary. So if I write an application and the three of us want to work on a project together, we can collaborate with anybody else being involved or being involved in the verification of transactions or anything. And if the idea is good and other people want to join it, they just start running the application with us. And if it's bad, then the application goes away or someone modifies it, releases a new version, and people agree to move to that. So it sort of mimics biological processes. There's a lot to it. They've been working on it for a very long time. Very cool. I'd be interested in. I haven't actually had a chance to talk to anybody who's interested in it. So yeah, I always sort of like. Check it out. Yeah, like I said, I'm thinking about maybe.
So you linked to Australia, you linked to go for this. So you just
if you want to use tools to party politics and coordination at a full scale, I think the key thing about this is it's very nice. It's just very
Oh, no, it's totally fine. I was just going to sit down and draw some because I'm if you'd like
Yeah, some people just don't want to talk about
sorry, I want you to write an application and take down it's not
It's a while before the next slide.
yeah, that's all right. I'll take this.
more general thing. It's a framework you can use or it's not actually not a platform that works. It's a platform that enables currency but also enables way to socialism. There's a lot there, but there's
like, I really appreciate it. Just finding the conversations I do. Like,
Okay, I'll carry on. Just looked at my watch and realised that I rattled on at great length. So, okay, so Morris died in 1896. Still wanting to get mumbo jumbo out of the world, and tributes from the socialist movement poured in both from overseas and at home. Alf Mattison, the Leeds engineer, described him as the inspirer of my youthful ideals. Tom Mann, outstanding trade union organiser, socialist, syndicalist, later communist, and for a short period in 1902, an organiser for the Socialist Party here in New Zealand, wrote that Morris was to me the outstanding man among the intellectuals of the time, with a personality so distinguished and commanding a type that I felt it to be a privilege to be identified with the same movement that held out such a glorious hope to the workers of the world. A postal worker wrote in to describe him as the greatest man that ever lived on this planet. Great and greatest are words that recur time and again. James Leatham recalled how he had last seen him on a cold morning in March on the back of a lorry by the Manchester Ship Canal. And believe you me, a cold morning in March by the Manchester Ship Canal is not to be recommended. Speaking to an audience of 2,000 working men, and Leatham described how not a man moved until Morris had finished. Robert Blatchford spoke for many when he wrote that, I cannot help thinking that it does not matter what goes into the Clarion this week because William Morris is dead. He was our best man and he is dead. How can we think of the movement today but as a thing struck motionless? I have just been reading the obituary notices in some of the Labour newspapers and I feel sick and sorry. The fine phrases, the elaborate compliments, the ostentatious parade of their own erudition, and the little covert sneers at the socialism Morris loved. All the tawdry upholsteries of these journalistic undertakers seem like desecration. Morris was not only a genius, he was a man. Strike at him where you would, he rang true. And finally, this tribute from a Lancashire SDF branch. Comrade Morris is not dead. There is not a socialist living would believe him dead, for he lives in the heart of all true men and women still, and will do so till the end of time. To what extent has that been borne out? During his lifetime, Morris had been the victim of every kind of sneer and attack. He had been accused of insincerity, of unpractical idealism, of hypocrisy. He had been criticised as a romantic fantasist. And his reinvention began immediately upon his death. There were three main schools of thought. Those who had a general respect for his achievements in literature and art and design, but preferred to keep his socialism in the background. Secondly, those who held him in contempt, dismissing his work as regressive, medieval and ridiculous. And third, those who misread and misused his socialist theory, either deliberately or through ignorance, to claim him as a distinctly British and ethical socialist. Most obituaries either ignored his socialism by talking about Morris the poet or Morris the designer, or denounced the force that drew him, without much regard for logic or for the facts of life, into a sentimental socialism. His early biographer, Mikhail, Burne-Jones's son-in-law, who had been hostile to Morris's revolutionary socialism, was not above tampering with quotations from Morris to show that he suffered from, quote, a mild educational form of the disease. And he argued that he turned his back on militant socialism when he left the Socialist League. John Bruce Glazier, a leading member of the Independent Labour Party, who liked to portray himself as Morris's heir, continued this theme. He focused on what has been called the religion of socialism, suggesting that Morris's emphasis on fellowship was of the come-to-Jesus type, rather than recognising that the real sources of his moral indignation lay in his hatred of imperialism and war, and in his understanding of the class struggle. By the end of World War I, the reformist ILP myth was in possession of the field. Between the wars, the emphasis was on Morris, the eminent Victorian, upon his links with the Pre-Raphaelites, upon Morris the poet, and upon the firm, which continued to produce wallpaper, tapestries and stained glass until the outbreak of the Second World War. Morris was held in sufficient regard to warrant celebrations upon the centenary of his birth in 1934. The ultimate insult being an oration delivered by Stanley Baldwin, the Conservative Prime Minister, who described Morris as a great, glorious and jolly human being who had left a legacy of beauty. The election of a Labour government in 1945 saw Prime Minister Clement Attlee suggest that the Labour Party owed more to Morris than Marx, and since then the likes of Barbara Castle and Tony Blair have claimed to be heirs to the Morris tradition. I hope I've got enough of a note of cynicism in my voice to suggest what I think of those views. There were those who attempted to swim against the tide. The Socialist Party of Great Britain, which proudly proclaims to be the oldest socialist party in existence, reprinted Art and Socialism on several occasions. The Glasgow anarchist Guy Aldred published two special William Morris editions of his journal. But the real fight back, if that is the appropriate word, began with the publication of Robin Page-Arno's William Morris, A Vindication in 1934. The non-such edition of Morris's work, edited by G.D.H. Cole, and May Morris's two supplementary volumes of her father's collected works, made available a wider selection of works on his art and his socialism. And then, in 1955, E.P. Thompson published his magnificent biography of Morris, From Romantic to Revolutionary. The revised edition in 1976 took his analysis further still, elevating Morris's moral critique of society to a position of equal importance alongside the economic and historical analysis of Marx. And following on from Thompson, there have been a number of works since then devoted solely to Morris's socialism. For example, Paul Meyer's epic two-volume William Morris, the Marxist Dreamer, amongst an ever-growing body of literature on all aspects of his work. Coincidentally, in the same year that Thompson published his biography of Morris, members of the Communist Party of Great Britain were instrumental in the founding of the William Morris Society, which in itself is a very strange story, but not one for now. The centenary of Morris's death in 1996 was marked by a whole series of events, including a conference at Oxford University, and it saw numerous reappraisals of his work, including some extraordinary attacks upon his reputation. Brian Sewell, the art critic of the London Evening Standard, called Morris a regressive pseudo-medieval fantasist who did lasting damage by reversing centuries of artistic progress. Dayan Sujic in The Guardian incredibly suggested that William Morris can be seen as an inspiration both for Pol Pot's Year Zero and the world of interiors. But what has been noticeable over the past 2 decades is the increasing recognition of the interconnectedness of Morris's views on art and socialism. The Centenary exhibition had a section devoted to his socialism, whilst the more recent Anarchy and Beauty exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, curated by his most recent biographer Fiona McCarthy, paid full attention to this. So what then is Morris's legacy, and do his ideas have any contemporary relevance? By any standards, Morris was one of the outstanding figures of the 19th century, a great and eminent Victorian, and in recent years there have been both radio and television programmes on his life and his influence. His designs, his wallpapers in particular, have never gone out of fashion. Golden Lily, for example, has been in continuous production since 1950. I'm really not sure how he would feel about H&M's recent use of his patterns for their new clothing range. Nor am I at all sure what he would think about the vast array of Morris-inspired gifts, toffee tins and coffee tins and tote bags and the like. I'm even less sure what he would have thought of Her Majesty's government using his fabrics in one of their nuclear submarines in the 1960s.